At the age of 19, I found myself in a situation I never thought would be mine. Pregnant, scared, and caught between the choice my family demanded and the future I wanted to build, I was left to make one of the hardest decisions of my life. My name is Lily Thomas, and this is my story. Growing up, our house felt more like a military camp than a home. My father, David Thomas, was a college professor who ran everything with strict rules and high expectations. Every part of my life seemed planned out for me, and there was no room for error. My older sister, Sophia, was the perfect child, obedient, always focused on school, constantly striving to make everyone around her happy. She had it all together, and it seemed like my parents could do no wrong when it came to her. She was their shining star, and no one could ever fault her for anything. I, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. I was always the one who pushed boundaries, who challenged rules, who refused to follow the path everyone thought I should walk. My father would snap at me during dinner, always reminding me to sit up straight, telling me, "A lady doesn't slouch." I'd roll my eyes, sit up as he demanded, but as soon as his attention shifted, I'd slouch again. It was a never-ending power struggle, and I always seemed to lose. No matter how hard I tried to rebel, it felt like I was just a disappointment to him. My mother, Margaret, was a quiet presence in our house. She didn't speak much, but her silence was just as loud. She enforced rules in her own way, disapproving glances at my clothes, my friends, anything that didn't meet her standards. "What will the neighbours think?" she would often ask, her voice filled with worry. She was more focused on appearances than anything else. Even though home often felt suffocating, I found small ways to carve out my own space. I spent hours in my room, reading books, dreaming of a life away from my parents' control. By the time I was 17, I had found someone who made me feel free, someone who understood me in a way my family never could. His name was Ben Wilson, a 20-year-old college student. We started dating in secret, knowing my parents would never approve. He was a free spirit, and when I was with him, I felt like I could breathe again. We would meet whenever we could, sneaking around behind their backs. For a while, it felt like I was finally gaining some control over my life. We shared laughter, dreams, and hope for the future, things that had been missing from my life. One evening, we met at our usual spot in a quiet park. It was our refuge, a place where we could be ourselves. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the park. Ben smiled as he saw me walking toward him, his eyes lighting up. "Hey, gorgeous," he greeted me, reaching out for a hug. I stepped into his arms, feeling his warmth and the familiar sense of safety. For that moment, nothing else mattered. But then I saw it, the shift in his expression. His smile faltered, his brows furrowed. "Lily, what's wrong?" she asked, pulling away to look at me more closely. I took a deep breath, swallowing hard as the fear washed over me. "I'm pregnant," I blurted out, the words tumbling out like a confession. It was as if the weight of the world suddenly came crashing down on my chest. For a few seconds, there was only silence between us. His face cycled through emotions, shock, disbelief, and finally, fear. His eyes searched mine, as though trying to find some sign that this was a joke, that I was just playing around. But I wasn't. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "I took 6 tests. They were all positive." Ben ran his hands through his hair, his eyes turning cold, distant. "You need to get rid of it," he said, his words flat, almost casual. "An abortion, Lily. It's the only option. We're too young for this. It'll ruin our lives." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was Ben, the boy I thought I loved, telling me to get rid of our baby as if it were just an inconvenience. I could feel the anger rising in my chest. My heart shattered, but I couldn't show it. "Get out of my sight," I hissed, my voice sharp with anger. I turned my back on him and walked away, leaving him standing there, frozen. He didn't follow me, and I didn't care. I was left alone with the weight of the decision I now had to make. The choice was mine, and yet it didn't feel like I had any choice at all. Telling my parents was even harder. The thought of them knowing the truth, of them seeing me in this light, made me sick to my stomach. How could I tell them? What would they say? I waited until after dinner when my father was in his usual spot in the living room, buried behind his newspaper. My mother was knitting as always, and Sophia stood in the background, a silent observer of my turmoil. My father's voice rang out in the house like it always did. "Lily, sit up straight. You're slouching again," he snapped without even looking up from his newspaper. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my nerves. This wasn't going to be easy. "I have something to tell you," I said, my voice shaking. My father lowered the newspaper and looked at me suspiciously, his sharp eyes narrowing. "What is it, Lily?" I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the worst. "I'm pregnant." The reaction was worse than I could have imagined. My father's face turned red as he started yelling about shame and disappointment. "What did I tell you about responsibility, about following the rules, and now this disgrace?" His voice shook with rage, and the words hit me like a slap. My mother burst into tears, her sobs echoing through the house. "What will the neighbors think?" she cried, clutching her hands together in despair. Sophia just stood there, shocked and disgusted. Her silence felt like a loud judgment, one that crushed me even more. I felt abandoned by everyone I thought loved me. "You'll get an abortion," my father said once he had calmed down enough to speak clearly. His voice was cold and final, cutting through the tension in the room. "We'll find a discreet clinic. No one has to know about this mistake." At first, I didn't want to listen, but the pressure from my family was too much. I wanted to shout, to scream at them that I wasn't a mistake, but I couldn't find the strength. I felt like I was suffocating under their expectations. A few days later, I found myself sitting in a doctor's office. My mother and Sophia sat beside me, like guards, both silent and judgmental. The doctor, a kind woman in her 50s, looked over my charts with a frown before looking up at me, her eyes full of concern. "Lily, I need to tell you something important," she said gently, her voice steady and reassuring. "Because of your medical history, if you have an abortion, there's a high chance you may never be able to have children again." Her words hit me hard, the shock of them running through me like electricity. Never be able to have children again. Suddenly the choice was clear. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'm not doing it. I'm keeping the baby." My mother gasped, and Sophia rolled her eyes. But I stood my ground. The drive home was tense and silent. Every street sign, every house we passed, felt like a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. When we walked through the door, my father was waiting, expecting news. His eyes searched mine, looking for any sign of compliance. "Well?" he demanded, his voice laced with impatience. "She wouldn't do it," my mother spat, frustrated. "After everything we've done for her." My father's face twisted with anger. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with each breath. "Get out! Pack your things and leave this house. You're no daughter of mine. I won't have you embarrassing this family with your condition." I felt the tears start to fall as I rushed to my room, grabbing some clothes and throwing them into a bag. My mind raced as I stuffed the items into the bag. Nothing made sense. Everything was spinning, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. As I headed for the door, my father's voice stopped me one last time. "And don't think about coming back. As far as we're concerned, you're dead to us." So shall I say. The door slammed behind me with a sound that felt final, devastating. I was alone, pregnant, homeless. In desperation, I called the only person I thought might help. My Aunt Rachel had always been the outcast of the family, living in another state, rarely speaking to my parents. "Aunt Rachel, please help," I said through tears. "Lily, what's wrong, sweetie?" Aunt Rachel's voice was warm and concerned. I explained everything, every painful detail of what had happened. There was a long pause after I finished. "Where are you now?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "Outside our house. They kicked me out," I whispered. "Stay right there," she said. "We're coming to get you." The drive to Aunt Rachel and Uncle Frank's house was long, but it gave me time to think about everything that had happened. Their house was small but cozy. As soon as we arrived, Aunt Rachel fussed over me, making sure I ate something, while Uncle Frank carried my bag to the spare room, which would now be mine. "It's not much," Uncle Frank said, placing the bag down, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." I looked around the small, warm room and felt a lump in my throat. "It's perfect," I whispered. The next few days felt like an endless blur of emotions, thoughts, and regrets. I sat in the small room that was now mine in Aunt Rachel's house, feeling both physically and emotionally exhausted. My parents had kicked me out, and I was alone in a new place with no one to turn to except for my aunt and uncle. The harsh words of my father echoed in my head, his cold rejection ringing louder than anything else. "You're dead to us," he'd said, and it felt like he meant it. The heaviness of those words weighed on my chest, suffocating me with every breath I took. Aunt Rachel and Uncle Frank did everything they could to make me feel comfortable, but the emptiness of being cast out was hard to shake. I couldn't stop thinking about my family, about how I had been raised in their image, how I had spent my whole life trying to live up to their standards, only to fall short in their eyes. I had never felt good enough for them, and now, with this pregnancy, it felt like I was a complete failure. I kept replaying the conversation I'd had with my father, his face twisted in disgust, his voice rising in anger. He had never looked at me the way he had when I told him I was pregnant. I had betrayed everything he stood for, and in his eyes, I was no longer his daughter. But here I was, in Aunt Rachel's spare room, with a tiny life growing inside of me. As the days passed, the fear and uncertainty began to settle into a deeper understanding. I wasn't sure how to navigate this new life I was building, but there was one thing I knew for sure. I wasn't going to let my baby feel the rejection I had. I wasn't going to let my family's mistakes define me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a choice that would shape my future, my baby's future, and my own sense of self-worth. Aunt Rachel had been a lifeline when I felt like I was drowning. She didn't ask questions about my family or why I was there. She just took me in, wrapped her arms around me, and told me everything would be okay. She offered me the support I never got at home. Uncle Frank, too, was quiet but kind. He didn't push me to talk or to open up, but he always made sure I had what I needed, whether it was food, a quiet space to think, or just someone to sit with me. Their unconditional support was something I had never known, and in their presence, I started to feel a sense of hope, however small it was. One evening, after dinner, Aunt Rachel sat down next to me on the couch. We hadn't talked much about the baby yet, but I knew it was coming. She gently reached for my hand, her voice soft but firm. "Lily," she began, "we've been thinking. We want to help you continue your education." I blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" Uncle Frank, who had been quietly reading his book beside us, set it down and looked at me. "We've saved some money over the years," he said. "We never had kids of our own, and we've always wanted to help someone in a way that matters. If you want, we can use that money to help you go to college." I was speechless. The idea of going to college had seemed impossible to me for so long, especially now with a baby on the way. How could I even think about school when I had no idea how I was going to take care of myself, let alone a child? The thought of being a single mother, struggling to make ends meet while trying to juggle classes, was overwhelming. But the offer my aunt and uncle made was a lifeline, a chance to do something more, something bigger than the small life I had envisioned for myself in this tiny town. It felt like the first real opportunity I had to build a future that was mine, and mine alone. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. "I never thought I could go to college, but can I really do this?" Aunt Rachel smiled warmly, squeezing my hand. "You don't have to do it alone, Lily. We'll be here every step of the way. We believe in you. This baby doesn't have to be the end of your dreams." Her words struck me deeply. In a world where I had always felt like I was falling short, Aunt Rachel and Uncle Frank were telling me that my dreams were still possible, that my mistakes didn't have to define my future. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt that kind of support, that kind of unconditional belief in me. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of it all sink in. With their help, I enrolled in a local community college, majoring in business management. It was a huge step, but it also felt like the first step toward rebuilding my life. It wasn't going to be easy, juggling classes, working part-time, and preparing for motherhood, but I wasn't going to let fear hold me back. I had made a decision, and now it was time to make it work. As the weeks passed, I found myself settling into a routine. I worked at a small diner downtown as a waitress. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and helped me save for the baby. Evelyn, the diner owner, was a kind woman who understood my situation. She was flexible with my hours, allowing me to balance work and school. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The pregnancy was hard on me, both physically and emotionally. I was exhausted all the time, and the nausea was overwhelming. But every time I felt like giving up, I remembered my aunt's words, "You're not alone." And with that, I found the strength to keep going. One of the most challenging parts was the constant reminder of my family's rejection. It wasn't just the physical absence of my parents, it was the emotional distance. I wondered if they ever thought about me, if they ever regretted pushing me away. I thought about my father, who had once been my hero. Now he was a distant figure in my mind, someone I barely recognized. How could he turn his back on me like that? How could he cast me aside so easily? I couldn't understand it, and the pain of it lingered in my heart like an open wound. But as I got deeper into my studies, and as my baby grew inside me, I started to realize something important. I didn't need my father's approval to succeed. I didn't need their validation to feel worthy. I had come so far already, away from their controlling grip, away from the suffocating expectations, and now I had the chance to build a life of my own. I often thought about my parents, wondering if they would ever regret their actions. Would they ever admit that they were wrong? Would they ever accept me back? It seemed unlikely. And yet there was a small part of me that hoped one day they would see me for who I truly was, not their failure, but their daughter. A strong, capable woman who had built a life for herself despite everything they had done to hold her back. The day my son Jonquil was born was both terrifying and beautiful. After hours of labor, I held him in my arms, gazing at his tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the life I had brought into the world. Aunt Rachel and Uncle Frank stood nearby, beaming with pride. Their support meant everything to me, and in that moment, I realized that I had everything I needed to succeed: love, hope, and the belief that I could do it. "What are you going to name him?" Aunt Rachel asked softly, her eyes filled with tenderness. "Jonquil," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "It means God is my judge, because no matter what anyone else thinks, I know I made the right choice." Jonquil's birth was a turning point in my life. It was the moment I fully embraced my role as a mother. And as hard as it was, I found joy in the small moments. The sound of his laughter, the way he curled his tiny hand around my finger, the way his eyes looked up at me with unconditional trust. It was these moments that kept me going. Over time, I continued my education, working hard to build a future for Jonquil and me. There were tough days when I wondered if I could keep up with everything. But I knew I had to try, for his sake. One day, I was scrolling through social media when a post from Sophia caught my eye. "Excited to announce that Ben and I are engaged. Can't wait to start our life together," the caption read. The photo showed Sophia smiling, her arm around Ben, the same Ben who had abandoned me when I was pregnant. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Ben had moved on, and now he was marrying my sister. I felt a wave of emotions: anger, hurt, betrayal. But it didn't last long. I looked over at Jonquil, peacefully playing in his crib, and I realized something important. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. Everything I needed was right here, in this little boy who had become my world. The weeks passed by in a blur of exhaustion, schoolwork, and doctor's appointments. It felt like time was moving faster than I could keep up with. My pregnancy was progressing, but with every passing day, I grew more anxious about the future. I had made my decision to keep the baby, but that didn't mean everything would be easy. My body was changing, my emotions were all over the place, and I had to deal with the judgment I felt from the world around me, especially when I encountered people from my past. At school, I kept my pregnancy a secret for as long as I could, but eventually it became impossible to hide. My classmates began to notice the subtle changes in my appearance, the way I wasn't as energetic as before, and the way I avoided certain activities. Some of them didn't say anything, but I could feel their eyes on me, always watching, always wondering. The whispers behind my back were inevitable, and as much as I tried to ignore them, they still stung. In the midst of all the stress, I focused on what I could control, my education. Despite everything, I was determined to finish my degree. I worked hard to stay on top of my classes, though there were days when the nausea was too much to bear, and I felt like I couldn't go on. But then I'd think of Jonquil, and the thought of him kept me going. I had to make a future for him, a future where he wouldn't feel the same rejection I had felt growing up. Aunt Rachel and Uncle Frank were there for me every step of the way. They were my rock. When I came home from school feeling defeated, Aunt Rachel would make me a cup of tea and sit with me while I vented. She never once judged me. Uncle Frank would occasionally joke about how many more bills we'd be paying once Jonquil arrived, but his sense of humour made it easier to breathe in those moments of overwhelming anxiety. Then came the day that changed everything, the day Jonquil was born. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had just finished a long shift at the diner. I was tired, my feet ached, and I could barely keep my eyes open. When I got home, Aunt Rachel noticed right away that something was different. My face was pale, and I was clearly in discomfort. "You okay, Lily?" she asked, concern etched across her face. "I don't know," I replied, feeling a tightness in my belly. "I think it's time." She immediately dropped what she was doing. "Let's get you to the hospital," she said, her voice calm but urgent. We rushed to the hospital, and as I lay there in the delivery room waiting for Jonquil to arrive, I was filled with a sense of dread and excitement. I was terrified about becoming a mother, about what the future would hold, but there was also a deep excitement. I would be holding my baby soon, a child I was bringing into the world on my own terms. And no matter how difficult it had been to get to this point, it was all worth it. Hours later, after the most grueling labour I had ever experienced, I finally held Jonquil in my arms. He was so small, so fragile. His tiny fingers curled around mine, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. This was my son, my beautiful boy, and nothing else in the world mattered in that moment. Aunt Rachel and Uncle Frank were there in the room, their smiles wide as they watched me hold him. "He's perfect, Lily," Aunt Rachel whispered, tears in her eyes. Uncle Frank stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, clearly moved by the sight of Jonquil. "Jonquil," I whispered to him, my voice trembling, "it means God is my judge. Because no matter what anyone else thinks, I know I made the right choice." The days following Jonquil's birth were filled with a mixture of joy and exhaustion. I had never felt so tired in my life. But every time I looked down at my son, I felt a deep sense of pride. This tiny human was mine, and I was going to do everything in my power to give him the life he deserved. During those first few weeks, I faced the usual struggles of being a new mother. I had to adjust to sleepless nights, changing diapers, and the constant worry that I wasn't doing things right. But with Aunt Rachel and Uncle Frank's support, I found my rhythm. They helped me whenever I needed it, whether it was cooking dinner or taking Jonquil for a walk, so I could get a few hours of rest. It wasn't just the physical demands of motherhood that were difficult, though. It was the emotional toll. I couldn't stop thinking about my family. What were my parents doing? Did they think about me? Did they care that I was struggling, that I was trying to raise my son in a world that seemed to want to tear me down at every turn? I would scroll through my phone, looking at photos of my parents and Sophia from social media, and I felt a pang of jealousy. They were living their lives as if nothing had happened, and I felt like I had been left behind. Then, one day I saw a post from Sophia, excited to announce that Ben and I are engaged, can't wait to start our life together. The picture showed Sophia smiling, her arm around Ben, the same Ben who had abandoned me when I needed him most. I stared at the photo for a long time, my heart breaking as I remembered how he had left me, how he had asked me to get rid of our baby. And now he was marrying my sister. I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and betrayal. How could he? How could he move on so easily after everything we had been through? How could he pretend like he had never been part of my life, part of the life we had created? It was as if he had erased me from his memory. But then I looked over at Jonquil, peacefully playing with his toys in his crib, and I realized something. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need Ben's approval, or my parents' approval, or anyone else's approval. I had Jonquil. He was my family now, and that was all that mattered. The pain of my past would always be a part of me, but I didn't need it to define me. I was stronger than I had ever realized, and I had a future ahead of me. It wasn't the future I had planned, but it was a future I could be proud of. And so I focused on Jonquil. I focused on the present, on the joy he brought into my life every day. I focused on the future, on the life I was going to build for him. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth having ever is. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my studies and my work. With Aunt Rachel's and Uncle Frank's continued support, I was able to graduate with my degree in business management. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a symbol of everything I had overcome. Every late night studying, every moment of doubt, every challenge I faced, it was all worth it. I also found a job managing a small restaurant. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and it gave me the chance to build a career. Jonquil was growing fast, and every day he became more curious about the world around him. I watched him take his first steps, say his first words, and my heart swelled with pride. He was everything to me. Life had thrown me so many curveballs, but in the end, it had given me something I never could have imagined. A family of my own. And with that, I found peace. I didn't need anyone else's validation. I didn't need to be accepted by the family who had rejected me. I had built a life, one step at a time, for Jonquil and me. As I looked at my son, now full of life and energy, I realized that everything I had been through had led me to this moment, a moment of pure joy, of fulfillment, of love. And that was enough. The months that followed Jonquil's birth felt like a blur of work, school, and sleepless nights. But as time passed, I started to adjust. Life became more routine, and the chaotic uncertainty that had dominated my world began to settle into something resembling stability. Jonquil grew stronger every day, his small victories and milestones becoming my source of joy. Each time he smiled at me, or laughed, or reached for my hand, I knew I was doing something right. For the first time in my life, I had a purpose, an undeniable connection to another human being that gave my life meaning. But even as I settled into motherhood, something gnawed at me. The rejection from my family, especially my father, still lingered like an open wound. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, like a piece of myself that I would never get back. The pain of being cast aside by my own parents, of being told I was no longer welcome in their lives, was something I couldn't forget. It wasn't just the physical absence of them, but the emotional absence too. How could they do this to me? How could they throw me away so easily, especially now that I was a mother? I tried to push these thoughts away, focusing on the present and the future, but they always crept back in. I had built a life for myself, yes, but it felt incomplete without the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I didn't need their approval, but I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever feel truly whole again without them in my life. It was during one of those late-night moments, when Jonquil was finally asleep, and I had time to think, that I decided something had to change. I had to face the truth. I had to confront my past, my family, and finally say what I had kept hidden for so long. The truth that I had buried under layers of shame and self-doubt. The truth that had driven me to make decisions I now questioned. I knew it wasn't going to be easy. I had spent years running away from the pain of my family's rejection, but it was time to stop hiding. If I was going to move forward, I had to confront my father. I had to see if there was any possibility of reconciliation, even if it meant risking further rejection. A few days later, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from my father's office, asking if I could come in for a meeting. My first reaction was panic. What did he want now? But then I realized something. My father was the mayor now. He was in a position of power, and that could only mean one thing. He had a public image to maintain. He wanted to control the narrative, and for some reason, he thought it was time to reach out to me. I took a deep breath and agreed to meet him. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I had to face him. After all, if I wanted peace, I had to be willing to fight for it, even if that meant facing my past head-on. When I arrived at his office, I was struck by how little had changed. The same sterile walls, the same imposing desk, the same aura of control. My father was sitting behind his desk, his expression unreadable as he looked up at me. There was a long silence before he spoke. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said, his voice cold, but not as angry as it had been when I left. "I don't know what you want from me, but I think we need to settle this." I felt my heart race as I sat across from him. There was no warmth in his voice, no apology, but I couldn't back down now. I had to confront him, even if it was painful. "Settle this?" I echoed, my voice shaky. "You don't get to just decide when to settle things, Dad. You kicked me out. You told me I was dead to you, and now you want to just pretend that everything's okay?" His face hardened. "I did what I thought was best for this family. I did what I had to do." I felt the anger rise in my chest. "What you thought was best? You chose your image over me, over your own daughter. You didn't care about me then, and you don't care about me now." He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "You don't understand, Lily. You don't know the pressure I was under. People depend on me. I had a reputation to maintain." "You had a family to protect," I shot back, my voice trembling. "But you didn't. You turned your back on me, on Jonquil, and now you want to fix it. Just like that." The silence that followed was deafening. My father didn't say anything for a long time. His eyes flickered with something, maybe regret, maybe guilt, but I couldn't tell. He finally spoke, his voice softer than before. I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his eyes lowering to the desk. "I made a mistake. I can't take it back." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to yell, to scream at him for everything he had put me through, but another part of me, the part that had been silently waiting for this moment, wanted to believe him. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally realized what he had done. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice quiet. "But I'm not going to hide any more. I'm not going to let you control my life. I'm going to live for me, for Jonquil." My father nodded slowly, as though he was finally starting to understand. "I know I can't make up for what I've done, but I want to be a part of your life, and Jonquil's, if you'll let me." The conversation didn't end with a clear resolution. There was no grand apology, no immediate healing. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. My father hadn't fully accepted me or my choices, but he had acknowledged his mistakes, and that was enough. For now. When I left his office, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The truth was out there, and while it wasn't perfect, it was a start. I didn't need my father's approval to move forward, but I also didn't need to carry the burden of his rejection any longer. I was free to live my life, to build my family, and to move on. As I walked back to Aunt Rachel and Uncle Frank's house, I realized something important. Facing the truth wasn't about getting others to accept me. It was about accepting myself. And I had done that. I had come so far, and there was no turning back. When I got home, I found Jonquil sitting in his high chair, his tiny hands reaching for me. He smiled when he saw me, his eyes full of love and trust. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened next, I had everything I needed. I had my son, and that was all that mattered. It had been 2 years since I first left home, and in those 2 years I had built a life for myself and Jonquil that I was proud of. I had earned my degree, secured a steady job managing the restaurant, and most importantly, I had built a home full of love and laughter with Aunt Rachel and Uncle Frank. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And in those quiet moments with Jonquil as we read books together or played in the backyard, I knew I was doing everything I could to provide him with the love and security that had been denied to me. I was no longer defined by my parents' rejection. I had my son, my aunt and uncle, and a future that was mine to shape. But as much as I had moved on, there was always a part of me that carried the weight of the past. The unresolved tension with my family, the unanswered questions, and the hurt from being cast aside still lingered, even as I tried to bury them beneath the surface. I had done what I needed to do to survive, but deep down, I knew there was something more that needed to happen before I could truly let go. It was a Sunday afternoon when I got the call. I had just finished cleaning up after lunch when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure whether to answer, but something inside me urged me to pick up. "Hello?" I said, trying to mask the uncertainty in my voice. "Lily?" a voice on the other end asked. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice I had spent countless nights dreaming of confronting. "Dad?" I asked, my throat tightening at the sound of his voice. "What do you want?" There was a long pause on the other end before he spoke again. "I know it's been a long time, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to talk to you." I closed my eyes, feeling a rush of emotions flood over me. Part of me wanted to hang up right then and there to avoid the pain and the anger that would inevitably resurface. But another part of me, the part that wanted closure, felt like I couldn't walk away from this. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm sorry, Lily," he said, his voice softer now. "I know I've hurt you, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for that. But I want to try. I want to be part of your life again, and I want to meet Jonquil." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I didn't know how to respond. I had spent so long convincing myself that I didn't need him, that I was better off without him. But now, with his apology hanging in the air, everything I had tried to bury came rushing back. The feelings of betrayal, the fear, the hurt, everything was still there, raw and painful. But there was also a part of me that had longed for this moment, that had wanted to hear those words for so long. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I said, my voice trembling. "You hurt me, Dad. You kicked me out of the house. You turned your back on me when I needed you the most." "I know," he said quietly, "and I can't take that back. But I want to do better. I want to be there for you and Jonquil, if you'll let me." There was silence on my end as I processed his words. I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't sure if I could trust him again. But as I looked over at Jonquil, sitting on the floor with his toy trucks, I realized that I didn't just have to make this decision for me. I had to make it for him too. I wanted him to know what it was like to have family, real family. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward healing. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "But this isn't going to be easy, and you'll have to prove that you're willing to do the work." "I understand," my father replied. "I'll do whatever it takes." The next few weeks were a blur of emotions and mixed feelings. My father kept his word and reached out regularly. At first it felt strange, almost foreign. I didn't know how to navigate this new version of our relationship. There were times when I wanted to give up, when the old wounds felt too raw to heal. But there were also moments of hope. Small gestures like him sending me flowers on my birthday or calling just to check in on Jonquil slowly began to chip away at the wall I had built around myself. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. But slowly, I started to allow him back into my life. I introduced him to Jonquil, cautiously at first, and I could see the look of wonder and regret in my father's eyes as he held his grandson for the first time. Jonquil, of course, had no idea who this man was, but he smiled at him, his innocence a reminder of the purity of love. Over time, my father became a more consistent presence. He didn't try to push his way into my life or my son's life. Instead, he respected the boundaries I set and worked to prove that he was genuinely trying to make amends. We had long conversations, and slowly, I began to see glimpses of the father I had once admired. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was something. One afternoon, about a month after our initial conversation, my father invited me to lunch at his office. He wanted to talk more about our relationship, about where we stood now. As I sat across from him, I realized how far we had come. There was still a lot of healing left to do, but we had made progress. "I'm proud of you, Lily," my father said, his voice earnest. "I know I wasn't there when you needed me, but I've seen how strong you've become. You've built a life for yourself, and I couldn't be more proud of you." The words, simple as they were, hit me harder than I expected. I had spent years longing for my father's approval, for him to see me as someone worthy of love. And now, here he was offering me the very thing I had always wanted. I felt the tightness in my chest loosen just a little bit, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was room for reconciliation. "I've had a lot of time to think about everything," I said softly, "and I realized that I can't change the past, but I can choose what comes next." He nodded, his eyes full of emotion. "I understand, and I'll do whatever it takes to be part of your future." The lunch ended with a quiet understanding between us. We didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, I felt like we were on the path to healing. Later that day, I sat with Jonquil on the couch, watching him play with his toys. As I looked at him, I felt a deep sense of peace. This little boy had changed everything for me. He had given me the strength to move forward, to heal from the past, and to create a future filled with love. My father wasn't perfect, and our relationship wasn't perfect either. But we were trying, and that was enough. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more emotional journeys just like it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Every week, we share powerful, real-life stories that inspire, heal, and remind us all of the strength we carry inside. Join our community, stay connected, and be part of a space where stories like these resonate with you. Your support means everything, and we can't wait to bring you the next chapter of this incredible journey. Subscribe now, and let's keep growing together.